Hello students, welcome to week 4 for COM 560 Communication Ethics. This week we are looking at moral theories and getting into some more of the theoretical implications of ethics from a communicative perspective. You'll see that we spent the first 3 weeks going through some philosophical perspectives to ethics to help us understand how philosophy fits in with communication and ethics together. This week we're going to move out of that with wrapping it up with our midterm paper and getting into looking at more some communication and ethical theories that help us illustrate some of those perspectives from that standpoint. So looking at it, this week we're reading chapter 6 and 8. We're also reading a communication boundary management handout for our discussion board number 4 that's attached within Blackboard. You're watching a couple videos related to the significance of ethics and looking at something on Kant's moral philosophy. You're completing discussion board number 4 on Friday with replies due on Sunday, and midterm paper is due on Sunday as well. If you look at your midterm, you're writing 6 to 8 pages utilizing APA format and citations with at least 3 outside sources. You'll see that there are 5 things I'm asking for you to do within your paper, and the 6th thing is reminding you of your outside sources. But those 5 things relate to this idea that I want you to look through the first 3 papers you wrote, your philosophical reflections papers, and think about the branches of philosophy. Think about axiology, ontology, teleology, and epistemology. Share some key scholars that attributed to this branch, so things that you found within your reflections, the theories and the journal articles and things that you integrated into the philosophical perspective, and discuss each of those branches within your paper and what they represent from a philosophical perspective that is related to communication ethics. So that's the first thing you're going to take and make those 3 papers and make a summation within your midterm paper about those 4 things. Then you're going to describe and explain how each of these branches intersect with each other and discuss how their overlap may be paramount or not to the nature of ethics and Christian thinking. So we're going to think about these branches Christianly, from a Christian perspective. The third thing we're going to do is describe the intersection relationship of each of these branches with communication ethics. Provide examples of how they may intersect or relate to another. The 4th thing is provide an example of at least one communication theory that relates to these branches in the field of communication and ethics. And then the 5th thing we will do is demonstrate how or if the philosophical branches in communication ethics intersect with other ethical paradigms, theories, or concepts presented within the course readings. So essentially what you're doing is we're creating a huge reflection and analysis of these philosophical views and what we've learned so far in communication ethics. We're going to get into some more practical and analytical things in the coming weeks. So I want to see here in your midterm what you've learned from the philosophical implications of ethics and how it relates to communication. So there's a lot you can draw on from those first 3 philosophical reflections to build it into your paper for your midterm assignment here. I really want you to start thinking about it more analytically and looking at this from an entire lens of philosophy and ethics, not just each individual branch of axiology, ontology, teleology, and so on. I want you to start to see how they relate together and where the link between those are and ethics and communication. If you have specific questions, let me know. Discussion number 4 asks you to write at least 400 words and then 2 responses that are 200 words each, looking at the idea of communication boundary management, CPM, or communication privacy management theory. There's 2 terms related to it. It's often referred to, Petroni's theory is often referred to as communication boundary management and also communication privacy management. So you're going to look at this and think about how we discern and ethically consider the ideas of this theory. What controversial choices do we make about maintaining boundaries when we are having these communicative conversations? What ethical implications do we make? So on and so forth. Specifically, we'll look at it from a dialogic ethical perspective, which you'll see within the course reading on privacy management and public discourse. So utilize one at least outside source besides the textbook to support your assertions. One thing is that the PDF attachment of the theory is in Blackboard. That would be a good outside source as well. Moving on to some of Kant's ideas of the categorical imperative and his theories of morality and such will help us understand where we're going with some of these things within the course. So Kant is known as one of the most significant contributors to ethical theories and part of the Enlightenment movement. So it's a cultural group of academics that sought to reform society and advance knowledge based on rational thinking. A lot of his early works looked at things related to the solar system, as part of gravitational systems and things like that. More importantly, a lot of Kant's philosophical perspectives took a role in invention that made him one of the most important philosophers at his time. He wanted to go back to the original question older ethicists would consider, which was, is a person good and is an action good? Kant then decided to base his ethical theory by examining the second part of a question, is an action good? So most of Kant's categorical imperative stems from some ontological and epistemological influences, but primarily looks at action, goodwill, and moral duty. The study of whether or not an action is ethical is known as normative ethics. There are two ways of thinking about this. Hume, a noted ethicist, said that a good feeling should precipitate good actions. Kant thought that a good action was the result of someone feeling they ought to act a certain way. What Kant went into deeper was what prompted us to act as if we ought to. Really, what kind of happened here is Kant decided and started to theorize that when we act as if we ought to, for example, demonstrating polite manners at the dinner table and so on and so forth, we might not be happy doing so. So why do we do it? Why do we act as if we ought to? Kant determined that there were three things that helped us get to this point: action, goodwill, and moral duty. He did tell us that there's a moral obligation to the notion that right actions are those that practical reason would assume as universal law. In that, Kant determined the goodness of action was not determined by the consequences or result of the action. Rather, Kant is not a consequentialist theorist, much like what we'll get into with utilitarianism in later weeks. Kant really decided that intention behind an action is the measure of whether an action is good or bad, which led us into goodwill. Kant determined that in order to intend a good action, a rational agent, or meaning a person, must process the good will to do the action. This is a measure of whether you are dealing with a morally good individual. Does the person possess the good will to do the action? That the action itself, the goodness of the action, was not determined by the consequences or result of the action, but by the person possessing the good will to do the action. When it comes to moral duty, Kant went on to say that possessing goodwill is one thing, but the reason we go on to do a good action is the result of the sense of obligation, what we ought to do. That's our moral duty to get it done. Philosophically, Kant felt that God was capable of perfection and humans were not. So we should not alter or use people as a means to an end. Rather, God will lead all to perfect happiness if we base universal maxims on what God would desire. So basically, Kant felt that there was a rational or disinterested spectator of what could now be God. And if God is not an interventionist, then God gave everyone complete and free will. So Kant used these ideas of the Lord's free will that he has bestowed on us, and acknowledging that he knew that God was perfect and humans were not, and that we needed to look at some of these ideas of action, goodwill, and moral duty in terms of the fact that God has given us free will. So if we look at what has prompted us to act as if we ought to do, looking at the rational agent, the person possessing goodwill to do the action, was in line with what God's divine revelation was for us in fulfilling free will, and had some relevance to it from that perspective. So it's important to look at it from that way of thinking. Kant's categorical imperative really told us that we need to act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And so simply put, an individual agent really should regard itself in determining if the decision is acting a certain way or the way that they're doing it because it's a rule in the future. There's some universal maxims according to Kant. One, we need to act according to the maxim that it would become a universal law. So if everyone stopped and fed the homeless, would this result in good everywhere? Yes. Two, we need to act so that you always treat other as an end and not a means to an end. So if you feel obligated to feed a homeless man and do so, you don't need to say, I am not thinking about the consequences or benefits of myself. I'm treating the person as an end. I feel inclined to do so because I feel about good about myself afterwards. So the two maxims that Kant tells us we act according to are acting according to the maxim that it would become universal law, meaning that if I did it, would everybody else do it? Or are you treating or acting as so that you're treating others as an end, never a means to an end? So for this, there's 5 rules for an action to be good. The one that we're looking at in particularly is his categorical imperative, which is all actions are moral and good if performed as a duty. Formula of universal law, actions must be applied to everyone and always result in good. 3, formula of humanity as an end, never treating anyone as a means to end or employing ideas like inclination to your own benefit to actions. 4, formula of autonomy, by manipulating another person to go against their moral right is wrong. All human beings are free, rational agents bound by a will that is logical. Kingdom of ends, imagining every maxim you employ and every action you take is forming a group of set laws of all humanity in an imaginary kingdom of ends. Perfect justice and perfect peace will ensue within that. Kant did not tell people what to do, but how to determine the right course of action. He's noted by saying we all had this unique ability to determine a good behavior using our prior reasoning. Making a decision to act is not examining consequences later, but to determine if we made a good decision. So you could believe that you can say that Kant believed in having a clear conscience. So what's important in saying and looking at it is that if we look at some of ideas of Kant, he's telling us that the action leads us to what the maximum is. Can it be universalized? Yes or no. Maximum is a duty, action is a moral. Maximum is not a duty, action is not a moral. Or we look at what we benefit from ego intention and moral intention and looking at Kant's duty of theory. The purple diagram tells us that Kant has a problem with the idea of just looking at consequences of actions. In the purple diagram, we will not know if a person acts out of duty or self-serving egoism. For this reason, the outcome is sometimes the wrong thing occurs for our society, or people are dishonest. We ask ourselves why people are dishonest all the time. Kant says it comes from the neglect of moral duty to a society of all as a whole. So when we're looking at the purple graph picture here, we see that for those that do not obey moral duty, they may or may not benefit, as they are not focused on some of the consequences of actions, but they ought to do that is right by other members of society. To act this way, we must be an intrinsic motivation towards moral duty. So Kant moves towards this idea of rejecting rational agents seek to gain virtues. Kant prefers to say virtues are within us already and need to be maintained. This is where we look at some of those ontological and teleological perspectives of reality and the end result and things of that nature from Kant. Kant is noted as saying that act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, as a way, always as an end and never as a means. So it's always looking at them as the end result, not as a means to get to the end. To clarify some things on communication privacy management, Sandra Petrino developed it in 91, and it came to fruition in 2002. And some of the perspectives of it tell us that as we look through this communication, it's really derived from social penetration theories. It considers the everyday decisions that we make about how much we disclose in private situations. It's a rules-based theory that allows us to see the perspectives of people. Therefore, there are no assumptions, but rather suppositions, which imply that there is guesswork and a hypothesis involved. The whole idea of the first of CPM is that private information or information that matters deeply to focus on a person. And the process within the suppositions of this rules-based management are a lesson to the person as a whole on their own. Privacy rules, characteristics, and development of attributes and rule development is guided by a people's decision criteria for revealing or concealing information to others. So in looking at this, people tend to develop thick and thin boundaries in trying to determine the risks and rewards of disclosing information. It's a disclosure theory. Thick boundaries are closed boundaries that allow little or no information to pass through. Thin boundaries are open, allowing them to pass through. Then there's a third process of this rules-based management, which again is boundary turbulence. This exists when management comes into conflict with one another in ethical situations. So many theorists of CPM have asserted that when individuals experience boundary turbulence due to ethical dilemmas, they will try to make adjustments so that they can reduce the turbulence to achieve some sort of coordination. This graphic here shows you the suppositions of private information, private boundaries, a sense of control and ownership we try to have, and management dialectics. The process in which we rule these managements is through privacy rule characteristics and boundary coordination and boundary turbulence. So it's really important to keep this in mind as we look at ethical scenarios. Additionally, like I mentioned, we're reading chapters 6 and 8. We're working on the communication boundary management handout, as well as watching 2 videos on ethics, completing discussion board number 4, as well as the midterm. If you have any questions, let me know. I look forward to interacting with you this week.